Ernest B. Johnson, who teaches multiculturalism at the college, often also known as Dr. J to his students. So Dr. J is a professor of multicultural studies in the Equity and Social Justice Department here at Shoreline Community College. He's also a part-time lecturer in African American Studies at the University of Washington. He's done lots of things, but amongst his many accomplishments that I want to mention is he's advised the Black Student Union and the Muslim Student Association and the All African Student Clubs here at Shoreline Community College. He's taken students on a summer study abroad course to Cape Town in 2003, 2006, and 2008, and he will be leading a similar group next summer, in 2015. So, PhD from the University of Washington, MA from the University of Khartoum in the Republic of Sudan. And join me in please giving a warm welcome. Okay.
So usually, Islamically, when you start something, you start with the intention. And my intention is to do the best I can in representing my experiences that I've been blessed to have over the course of my life, particularly the experiences I had studying under Ustaz Mahmoud Muhammad Taha for essentially 8 years in the Sudan of my 9 years in the Sudan. The reason that I'm a little bit nervous right now is that since I've returned from Sudan in 1986, I haven't spoken here at Shoreline or in this country. I've done so in Canada on this topic. Maybe that's not exactly true. One time at the U.S. Institute of Peace in D.C., I did speak on this topic, but I typically haven't. And so I want to try to give a little bit of an idea of his thought and then a little bit of my interaction with his community and what his thought meant to me in the context of that community and also in the context of my work subsequent to that, particularly teaching multicultural studies here at Shoreline. So the story begins in 1977, University of Hawaii. I had become a Muslim in October of 1975, and I was trying to figure out how Islam related to the political work that I was doing in ethnic studies, how Islam related to the fact that in my own family and in the family of many people I knew, women were a very capable and competent voice and presence within those families. And I was also very much drawn to the idea that in my study of African American history, looking at the position that Muhammad Ali took with regard to the Vietnam War, how he was willing to sacrifice his heavyweight title in order to refuse to go to Vietnam to fight, and the fact that he was a Muslim was significant to me. The other significant impression in my community about Islam came from Malcolm X, one of the heroes of my generation, for the people that I associated with in Hawaii at the time, many of them African American. We studied together, did martial arts together, and so forth. Malcolm was our hero. And in the words of Ossie Davis, Malcolm was our manhood. And so the fact that he was a Muslim also had a tremendous impression on me. So in 1977, a Muslim came to Hawaii by the name of Sheikh Mohammed. Sheikh Mohammed directed me towards the Sudan. He introduced me to Sudanese people in Hawaii who were going to school with me, who I didn't know. And within a couple of years, I was accompanying Salman and his wife Maimuna to Sudan in the summer of 1977. And before I went, I asked Salman a question. He was a graduate student at the University of Hawaii at the time. And I asked him a question. I said, is there someone in Sudan because I was impressed by the Sudanese. I was impressed by the way that they conducted and carried themselves as human beings. And so I was saying, was there someone in Sudan who had a modern understanding of Islam? And he stopped and he thought and he told me, yeah, there's one man. He said, there's a man named Mahmoud Muhammad Taha in Sudan. He has a very progressive idea of Islam. I've read all his books, and I could introduce you to him or find someone who can. So after less than a month, I went to Sudan during Ramadan, 1977, and within 3 weeks, I was meeting Ustaz Mahmoud, and I was exposed to his presence, first of all, as a person. The first thing I noticed about him is that he was immaculate every time I saw him. The other thing I noticed about him is that he was consistent in his temperament and in his treatment of people every time that I saw him. And so this impressed me. I was drawn towards him, and then I started to find out some things about his thinking, his ideology, which was one of the most attractive things about him after his character. And here's an example of something that caught my attention. He talked about this idea that, the purpose of this human caravan is for each of us to be going into our own orbits of self-realization. And this was very near and dear to me because I had been on my own path of trying to become more aware and more knowledgeable and better capable of practicing what I preach. This is what led me to this understanding of Islam. And so his ideas and the way that he expressed them really started to attract me from the time that I first met him. I also was impressed with the young people that were associated with him. The first thing I noticed is that he had women in leadership. And this was very important to me. I saw this as being something that made his understanding of Islam more genuine to me, more real to me, and more applicable in what was the 20th century at that time, is that he believed in the full equality between men and women. And to me, that's elementary. That's elementary. And so that aspect of his teaching was very important. In the picture is his daughter. His daughter is an attorney. I was speaking to her recently by email. She wished me luck with this presentation, and since it's being filmed, she would like to actually see what I'm saying. And the women in our movement were both leaders within our movement, and they were encouraged to reach for the same heights and to adhere to the personal practices of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as the rest of us were doing. So this attracted me. When I first arrived at Ustaz Mahmoud's house, this bus was coming in just as I had finished my conversation with him. He had given me a couple of pamphlets in English to read, and I was leaving with Salman and a friend of his. And this bus came down the road towards his house, and on it I could hear something being chanted, and I asked him what was being said. He said they're chanting Allah, and this is what our movement did. As we walked or we drove through the streets, we chanted the name of God. And I was moved by that. And you see me in that picture, the second person. The first one in the Imma is Jalal. He was the third brother in our movement, and that's me actually on the bus. But one of the things that attracted me to the Sudanese, to this particular movement, was the first Ustaz Mahmoud, and then his followers, and then the devotion that I saw in his followers. So these folks were coming back from the market where they had finished their sunset prayer, gone into the town, and they were disseminating our ideas on the street corners, on little plebiscites on the street corner. And then that we would come back to Stas's house, and usually it couldn't contain us. It was a pretty small home. And we would sit out in a field next to his house, and we would report back on our experiences during the day. Ustaz Mahmoud's history is, I guess, a little bit important here to touch on, and that is that he started the first political party in the Sudan that called for complete independence from the British and from the Egyptians. He was disappointed with the other Sudanese intellectuals at the time, and this is in 1945, who were saying that, of course, if we develop our nation, our modern nation, it has to be affiliated with one of these strong countries like Egypt or England, who was the colonizer at that time. And Ustaz was saying, well, that's nonsense. We should be asking for an independent Sudan, stand on our own feet, forge our own way forward. And he had a significant following at that time, and he ran afoul of the British. He was arrested several times. On his second arrest, he was imprisoned for 2 years for leading a demonstration. And it was during that imprisonment between 1946 and 1948 that he devoted himself to prayer and fasting in the methodology of the Prophet Muhammad, where he gained his insights into the Quran. They don't come from a purely intellectual study of Islam. They come from the application of the worship practices of the Prophet of Islam, and through that application, gaining insight into an understanding of the Quran, which is quite novel, which is the one that I'm going to talk to you about. It's one that attracted me, and it attracted people like Fadl. Many of the initial followers of Ustaz Mahmoud, when it was a political party, did not remain with him after he came out of prison, because when he came out of prison, he was introducing Islamic elements into his political party. And some of the people that just wanted to overthrow the British and have an independent Sudan were not interested in the religious aspects of it. Ustaz Mahmoud's clarity was that the answer was within the Quran and a new understanding of the Quran. And my uncle Fadl here, who you see, was one of the people that followed Ustaz Mahmoud during the political struggle and continued with him all of his life. In fact, in 1954, in the magazine that the Republican Brothers Political Party, Republican Political Party it was called, in 1954 published this newspaper, and there was a section of the newspaper that was devoted towards women. And you see here, some of you might not be able to see so clearly, but he says some interesting things here about how central women are, and women are like the heart of the body, and if women are healthy, then the body is healthy, and if they're not healthy, then the whole body is not healthy. So a woman in a civilized society should have more priority than a man. She raises the children, boys and girls. She's critical in the development of the society, and she's at the core of it. And so this was his ideas in 1954. Thoughts like this in 1954 were rare anywhere. Being articulated in this form in the Islamic world were revolutionary, really. And his ideas were not immediately attracted to everybody. But he was saying that to truly understand Islam is to truly understand monotheism. And to truly understand monotheism is that, we all come from the same creator. He created us all in his image, not in the sense that he looked like us, but in the sense that we have certain qualities that he has, or she has, both feminine and masculine qualities. Particularly our qualities related to our human character, our better character, comes from our creator. And as such, Ustaz was saying that monotheism dictates that creator is going to not discriminate against his creation without a purpose, without a reason. The idea that women are somehow created less than man is inconsistent with the idea of a just and compassionate God. He expresses his ideas here, and he goes on to say something really interesting, which is caught my attention early, and it took me a while to understand it, and I'm still working on that understanding. But it's the idea that when he talks about Islam, he's not talking about Islam as people understand it now. not in the Islamic world or outside of the Islamic world. He's talking about this ultimate Islam. He's talking about Islam at the level of submitting to one's creator, where the creature submits his will to the creator. That Islam. And he says that's been the religion since the very beginning of this process, from Adam up to present. And he talks about, he explained it to me one time by drawing a pyramid or a triangle, and talking at the base of the triangle you have Adam, and at the pinnacle of the triangle you have the return of Christ, the Messiah. And that's the level of Islam that he's talking about, the one that Christ also will be part of establishing on the earth. That's a whole different Islam than the one that we're seeing now, cutting off people's heads and running around, trying to terrorize and frighten people to somehow follow something that they think their image of God has created. That has nothing to do with Islam. That's the antithesis of Islam. Islam really is about peace. The word itself comes from the word in Arabic that means to submit to your creator in order to gain peace and contentment with his will, and then to live out that contentment in your interactions with other human beings. That's Islam. Compare that definition with what is being represented as Islam right now, and you'll see that it has very little in common. And it's a crime and a shame that the religion is being misrepresented in the way that it is. So, Ustaz was asked one time to summarize these thinkings of yours, these strange ideas of yours, Mahmoud. We don't really know what you're about. You've got so many different ideas. You're talking about, politics. You're talking about economics. You're talking about a second message of Islam. What is it that you're about? He said, my work is my daughters. And these are not his daughters. These are Fadl's daughters. This is Nawal and Rashida. But he meant that the core of what he's about is the upliftment of women. That's at the core of his ideology, right? Because if that doesn't happen, then we haven't moved towards a point of equality. We haven't moved beyond our animal past, our station as mankind, a kind of a man, a kind of a human, until we move to that point of equality. So that's what he's talking about. We have women in leadership in the movement. This is Huda. And okay. So Huda's amazing. So she was given a talk once in a club, and a man who considered himself a protector of Islam came into the back of the club with his cane, his walking cane, about that thick around, on his shoulders, and he stood in the back, and Huda was speaking about our ideas, and he gradually walked to the front. She was at a podium like the podium that I'm at, and he walked straight up to her, he raised the cane, and he slammed it down on the podium. And she ignored him and continued to speak. She ignored him and continued to speak. What gave her the capacity to do that is she had internalized the teachings of Ustaz Mahmoud. So what are those teachings? What he's saying is that the true understanding of Islam, and this would be true of all religions, cannot be found within the language that the religion is revealed in, whether it be Hebrew or Greek or Arabic or Aramaic or English, for that matter. The understanding requires a relationship with your Creator. It requires worship. It requires a profound understanding of monotheism in order to understand it. So it's not just understanding the language rationally, but it's cultivating that clarity of mind and calmness of heart and consistency of character that will allow one to actually turn the other cheek when you're slapped, which no one's doing right now. So, Huda's clarity allowed her, when the gentleman walked forward with his cane and slammed it down on the podium, to ignore him. Because at that moment, she was fearing nothing other than God. She feared no man at that moment. She felt what she was doing was God's will, and let what happened, happen. Now, the three equalities. Part of what allowed Huda to be so courageous was that she had dedicated herself to the methodology of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as Ustaz Mahmoud had helped us clarify, particularly his practice of worship, and more particularly his practice of praying during the night. Our discipline was, after we went to work during the day, and we worked many different jobs, most of us were teachers, we'd come home, we'd travel to our teacher's house for sunset prayer. We'd get on the buses, go distribute books. We'd come back about 8 o'clock. We'd meet until about 10:30. We'd go home and we would eat. We would pray our night prayer as the Prophet did, not at a particular time, but the last thing he did before he went to sleep. That's important. And then we would sleep a portion of the night, and in the last third of the night, we would have the intention of getting up and praying the night prayer. And this was like a substitution for what the mystics of old used to do by going up into the caves and getting as far away from human beings as they possibly could. We kind of recreated that in the nighttime, as the Prophet did. So Ustaz's ideas here, I think this is where I can't really see with the screen here, but I should know where I am. And Ustaz Mahmoud is saying that really the prayer is the core of it, the worship is the core of it, but one has to also be concerned about the society. We have to restructure our society so that it provides the conditions through which people can get on that journey of self-realization. And those conditions relate to the three equalities: economically, socialism. And we don't get that from Marx. We're not talking about Marxism. Please don't make that association. We're talking about the Holy Prophet Muhammad, a man who, during his life, didn't accumulate wealth. A man who we know from the hadith that speak about his behavior, that he was once leading the prayer, and he put his hands up, and before he started praying with all of his community behind him, he just left and went back home and came back. And after the prayer, his companions asked him, "What happened? We've never seen you do that before." He said, "I remembered that I had left a dinar, a dollar, in my home. And I didn't want to have anything stored up as if I needed to store things, as if God was not going to take care of me." So he went and took that money and distributed and came back and led the prayer. There's another example of the Prophet where, peace be upon him, he and his wife Aisha were at home and guests came to his house for lunch, and he said, "Aisha, please prepare our guests a meal." She went into the kitchen and she came back very humbly and whispered to him, "We don't have any food." And he said, "No, I'm sure we have something. Please look again. We should serve our guests something. It's lunchtime." And she went in there and she only found a nebuk. A nebuk is like a dried cherry. And he said, "Fine, then divide it up and serve it to our guests." That's all he had accumulated in his home, was one small cherry-sized dried piece of fruit. Why? Because he didn't accumulate. So our concept of socialism is really based upon his own practice. Also, democracy. Many people say, well, democracy is not in the Quran, the word democracy, which is true. It's not. But the democracy is at the core of the messages of the Quran. It has to do with human dignity. It has to do with the integrity and the dignity of the human being. Allowing people, all people, male, female, to self-determine. Trans, to self-determine. Right? That's what democracy is about. So the other equality that is necessary to have is we need to have a better distribution of wealth. As long as Ustaz Mahmoud says, as long as you have a society at war, a society where you have poor people, a society where children are going to bed hungry, you're not going to ever have a wholesome society, what he calls a mujtama salim. In order to arrive at that society, people shouldn't be worrying about, their next meal. So once you establish that economic reality, and he has a formula for how to achieve it, which I won't go into, maybe you'll question about it. He says you also have to self-empower people with the right to self-determine their own destiny, democracy, self-government. And then the third criteria is social equality. We need to be able to develop a society based upon the political and economic system, merging socialism and capitalism, if you will, into a society, socialism and democracy, if you will. Capitalism will still be part of it because we're not talking about Marxism again. We're not going to do away with free enterprise. We just want to regulate it. Ustaz said a method of 7, a factor of 7. The richest people in your society should not be more than 7 times wealthier than the poorest. And if people want to gain more money, they have to pull the base up. You can gain as much as you want, but pull the base up with you. Do not have a society like our own where the top 20% is making 13 times the amount of the bottom 20%. And that bottom 20% of the children in there go to bed hungry. That's not a way forward, and that's not a sustainable society. Social equality has to do with people not being discriminated against based upon who they are, their categories. Race, class, gender, religion. A society governed by a constitution that protects all the rights of all of its citizens. He said the criteria for that society is that any group within the society will be able to marry from any other group. Until we've reached that, we don't have social equality in our society. As long as there's pariahs in the society, groups that are looked at as less than, undesirable, and so forth, we're not achieving our values of monotheism. We're not achieving the type of potential that we have as human beings. These are the ideas of Ustaz. This is the house I lived in. Those are my brothers. That's me with the little skull cap on over there in that dark doorway. And at night we would get up and pray, and sometimes there would be so many people praying in that house I couldn't find a corner to pray in at night. That's our houses. We had 4 different houses. We would leave our houses at sunset prayer. We'd go to our teacher's house. We'd walk there chanting through the streets. We would arrive there. Ustaz would be there with all of the sisters. The sisters lived in his house, in his compound. We'd come from the 4 houses in the city I was in. There were other houses around the country. And we would chant until the sun set. Chant Allah, Allah, Allah. Until the sun set. That's the zikr. That's Ustaz Mahmoud in the middle of the chanting circle. And so these ideas are sensible ideas, but they're not popular ideas. And Ustaz Mahmoud talks about some of the current misunderstandings of Islam that are being represented as Islam. And he says that many people who now are calling for Islam by the sword misunderstand the ethos of Islam. They misunderstand the idea that the most often repeated verse in the world, and there's data to support this, is the Al-Fatiha, the opening of the Quran. All Muslims pray, most Muslims pray, nearly all, 5 times a day. And each prayer, you have a minimum of repeating Al-Fatiha 3 times. And there's about 1 billion Muslims, so you do the math. The core of that opening of the Quran is that the verse Al-Rahman Al-Rahim is repeated twice within that prayer. That our Creator says that His nature is compassion and mercy. He is the most compassionate and the most merciful. That's the ethos of Islam. And as I said before, Islam means peace. Peace within yourself so that you can be at peace with the rest of creation, particularly other human beings, who we have no right to assert our will over. We didn't create them. We don't own them. We need to be focusing on our own stuff. The Holy Prophet said, none of you is a true believer until you want for your brother what you want for yourself, brother and sister. But he was speaking to that community in the 7th century, so he needed to say brother. Christ said something like that, right? Buddha said something like that. Confucius said something like that. What did Confucius say? It's the same teaching. And so Ustaz talks about that misunderstanding both of the ethos and the time. And this is the core part of his teaching, that what most people think is Islam right now was a level of revelation that was tailor-made for the 7th century and slightly beyond. That we call the first message. It was a message that came at a time and in a place where women didn't even have the right to life. The Bedouin Arabs at that time, including the tribe of the Holy Prophet, of course not the Prophet's behavior, but his tribe that he tried to bring to monotheism, were burying their daughters alive at birth. So the idea of bringing social equality to them was far-fetched. And this is why the prophets are instructed to teach people according to their capacity and their level of understanding. That's a hadith from the Prophet. So that Islam which came was Islam that was perfectly suited for that time, say the 7th century. But within the Quran is an understanding that is suited for this time. This is what Ustaz Mahmoud is illuminating, and he's doing it in a way that's not haphazard. He's doing it in a way by going back to Mecca and to look at those verses and those chapters and suggesting that those original chapters revealed in Mecca are the universal, right, humanitarian principles of Islam. And it's irrational to assume that they were revealed and then abrogated and we're supposed to follow lesser principles for the rest of eternity. It doesn't make sense. The highest principles of the Quran are not the principles that govern Islamic law. And this is critical. The idea of a violent jihad is not supported in the principles of Mecca. In Mecca, the Muslims, even when they were attacked, did not defend themselves, let alone go on the offensive. They were nonviolent in Mecca. And it's only when we come to Medina where the teachings of Mecca were beyond the capacity of people to apply, that you have that first message taking place, Islamic law as we know it. That law supports the idea of slavery. That law supports the idea of inequality between men and women. That law supports the idea that you can spread religion forcibly on other people. That was appropriate in the 7th century. It is not even close to being appropriate in the 21st century. Stas Mahmoud gave an analogy one time, then I'm going to open it for questions. His analogy is that you have this child who's 7 years old, and you buy them and design for them a perfect outfit. And they look really good in the outfit because it's perfectly suited for them. Now, 14 years later, that child is 21. And we're trying to place the same outfit on that child, suggesting that this is the way in which it was meant to be. It is really almost that absurd. I don't mean to offend anybody, but I do mean to say that the teachings of Ustaz Mahmood are teachings that are very relevant to our time. They're very consistent. They are derived from the Quran and the Hadith. They are supported by verses from the Quran and from the Hadith. And they speak towards the equality and the unity of all human beings, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and otherwise. So I'll stop there and take questions.
So I have a question. How does Islam religions and belief related to Vietnam War, like you said at the beginning of the presentation?
Okay. If I understood the question, how does the this understanding of Islam relate to the Vietnam War? Okay. Wow. The idea that Ustaz Mahmood puts forward is that war is really the result of the failure of diplomacy. And to have to solve your problems violently suggests that you failed already. And violent solutions to problems are short-lived and often create more problems. And so I would say that his teachings with regard to the Vietnam War is that at the core of being worshipful is to be responsible. And responsibility is the obligation of nations that are powerful, just as it's the obligations of people that are powerful. So just as men need to be responsible, are obliged to be responsible for our power with respect to women, powerful nations like the United States or France before us is obliged to be responsible with their exercise of power. And going into nations and exploiting them for their resources, and then colonizing them, and trying to destroy them when they resist you for your colonization, is irresponsible behavior because nobody would want that applied to themselves. And so I think that he would be clear on the Vietnam War, and war in general is that it is the antithesis of religion, of monotheism, to think that we should need to destroy our brother or our sister in order to achieve our ends. We can achieve our ends humanitarily with one another by respecting one another and having conversations with one another. We don't need to send, drones in order to solve our problems. So that would, I think, be my understanding of his consistency is that war is not something we believe in. We believe, in fact, in nonviolence. Monotheism really is expressed most clearly by Christ. And Christ says, if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him or her the other cheek. Why? Because know that there's a hand behind that hand, and that's the hand of God.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I have a question about relationships between different, forms of Islam. I recently lived in Liberia, and I've heard many of my colleagues speak some of the things that you've spoken about, and they identify themselves as Ahmadiyya Muslims. So what's the relationship between
That's
what
good.
you're speaking about and their understanding?
Yeah, so Ustaz Mahmood's ideas come out of the Islamic mystic tradition, Sufis. And so the Ahmadiyya also, I think, identify themselves as Sufis. And the similarity, there's a strong overlap between his thinking and many of the Sufi sages of the past and many of the sages and mystics from other religions in the past. Because many of them are saying the same thing. right? It boils down to doing unto others as you want done to yourself in the end of the day, right? And so that's the ultimate teaching. And that teaching's within Islam. There's no compulsion in religion, la ikrah fi din. You don't impose yourself on other people. There's another level, which is you can take the sword in your hand. And that's where the understanding is so important to distinguish between what was the tertiary or secondary level of revelation and what was the original message. But yeah, there's a lot of similarities. Ustaz Mahmoud was revered by the Sufi community in Sudan. He was very much so. There's some exceptions to that because you find traditionalists amongst Sufis as well. And so many of the traditionalists, the Salafi, who were Sufi, did not accept his ideas because no one was saying them before him. And so they didn't trust them. But rationally, what was very interesting is in the 9 years I was there and since, I haven't heard rational arguments to disprove what he's articulating. I went a little beyond your question.
Hi, Dr. J.
Hi.
Thank you. I was really interested in the part where you were talking about Islamic law, and I'm assuming Islamic law versus actual Islamic doctrine. And just looking at many of the countries that are following Islamic law, are those countries generally being run by, led by the religious faction of Islam, or is it more political?
Yeah, that's good. One of the things about Islam that attracted me to it is there's not a distinction between the secular and the sacred. And this attracted me. But of course, that can be problematic. Because if people on the sacred side of the house, the spiritual side of the house, want to impose their understanding on other people and discriminate against people because they don't endorse the same religion that they endorse, then it becomes, religion then becomes a tool of oppression. And so what is true, I think, is that most of the areas where you see the imposition of Islamic law is coming from a strong religious sector, and Ustaz Mahmoud often referred to them as Salafis, they're traditionalists. Many of them believe that the best days of Islam are in the past, that existed during the life of the Prophet in the 7th century. And they want to try to force the 21st century to conform to that time. And of course, that's not rational. People back then were riding camels. They were communicating by pigeons. And to suggest that the legislation that was perfect for them is perfect for the 21st century is not rational. And we shouldn't expect a creator God of these universes to have come up with that idea. So, yeah, underlying a lot of the imposition of Islamic law are traditionalists, mainly men, dominated by men who have the floor. And of course, many women have internalized that understanding as well. But at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what do they offer, right, to move the society forward? What do they offer that actually meets the needs and solves the problems of people in the contemporary world? And once that question is asked, the shortcomings become really apparent. But I want to also say that at the core of the traditionalists, you often find a person who's a very believing person. They're sincere in their belief. It's just their understanding that has been allowed to stray from the path, right? It's just their understanding, but not necessarily their character. And this is important when we look at people who are doing some really horrendous things out there. A lot of the followers of those people and a lot of these young people in the West that are hopping on planes and going over to Syria and Iraq to join, say, ISIL, I will use that term for them, they're sincere in their belief. They really think that they're going to join something that is going to bring about Islam on earth. And the people most responsible for that misunderstanding are the so-called scholars who are perpetuating that idea. They are responsible for it.
Sorry, I have asked a second question. Is that I found a lot of any religions is how the American culture depicts certain image of any religion from Buddhism, Islam as some sort of like for Buddhism as holy religions and for Islam as a terrorist religions. And how would you feel that to image that not only that is like because I'm taking class and the scholar who did the study based on he watched over 1,000 movies and most of the image of Islamic pictures like terrorists, very sexualized, high sexualized people.
Okay. All right. Right. And so our understanding of Muslims is very much influenced by a history of misrepresentation in the West, going all the way back to the Orientalists and coming forward. And it's also partly the responsibility of Muslims. I want to say that as well. And particularly the scholars who are not distinguishing the law, the code, from the path, from the reality, from the essence. You know, Stas Mahmoud says like it's as if there's a fruit and we're just living in the rind of the fruit. And the meat of the fruit, the sweetness of the fruit is being ignored. And so that's the Muslim side of the equation. The West has to take responsibility for a history of distorting Islam. This has happened and it's still going on where because there are Muslims who are misbehaving in the world, and there's plenty of them, all Muslims are somehow bad. That's not an adult way to look at the world. Why are we still making those types of leaps, right? But we do. In the press and even some of our scholarship, our academicians are responsible here. But Muslims have to also take responsibility for believing that Islamic law is the solution to 21st century problems. Because once we perpetuate that, then we are engaged in behaviors which are easily criticized and easily dismissed. Thank you, folks. Thank you all for coming out. That's great.